The frigid Montana wind rattled the cabin windows as Nora Graham stared out at the darkening sky, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake by staying through winter in this remote mountain valley. The year was 1882, and the 22-year-old schoolteacher from Boston had come west seeking adventure and independence, qualities sorely lacking in her previous life of afternoon teas and eligible bachelor introductions. She'd taken a position at the small mining settlement of Silver Crest, teaching the children of miners and shopkeepers. When the school term ended and most families departed for lower elevations before winter's grip tightened, Nora had stubbornly decided to remain in the cabin she'd rented, determined to use the solitude to write the novel she'd always dreamed of creating. Now, as December's fury descended upon the mountains, doubt crept into her heart. The snow had been falling steadily for 3 days, piling higher than she'd ever witnessed. The small woodpile beside her cabin dwindled faster than anticipated. Her nearest neighbor was Mr. Iverson, the shopkeeper, whose establishment sat a mile down the valley, though she hadn't seen him in days. Nora added another log to her fire and tried to focus on her writing. Her fingers were stiff despite the gloves she wore indoors. The ink threatened to freeze in its bottle. She wrote another paragraph about her heroine's journey across the Atlantic, but her mind kept wandering to her own predicament. A sound made her pause. At first, she thought it was the wind, but then she recognized the distinctive rhythm of horse hooves crunching through snow. Nora rushed to the window, wiping away the frost with her sleeve. Through the swirling white, she could just make out a rider approaching. The figure dismounted with practiced ease despite the deep snow and led his horse toward her small stable. Nora grabbed her shawl and opened the door, immediately regretting the decision as the bitter cold assaulted her. "Hello," she called out, squinting against the snow. The man turned, revealing a face partially hidden by a scarf. He pulled it down, showing a strong jaw darkened with several days' growth of beard. "Madam," he said with a nod. "Name's Flynn Irwin. I've been checking on folks up and down the valley, storm's getting worse." "I'm Nora Graham," she replied, suddenly aware of how unprepared she must appear. "Please, come inside once you've settled your horse." Flynn nodded again and continued leading his mount to the stable. Nora hurried back inside, hastily straightening her small living space and putting on water for coffee. By the time Flynn entered, stomping snow from his boots, she had composed herself somewhat. "Thank you for checking on people," she said, taking his coat. "That's very kind." "Not kindness, madam. Necessity." His voice was deep, with a slight drawl that suggested origins farther south. "Folks die in these mountains when they don't watch out for each other." Flynn was tall, with broad shoulders and eyes the color of a summer storm. Nora guessed him to be in his late 20s. His hands were rough and calloused as he accepted the steaming coffee she offered. "You shouldn't be up here alone," he said bluntly after his first sip. "Most everybody else has gone down to Riverton for winter." "I'm perfectly capable," Nora began defensively. "Begging your pardon, but capability doesn't matter much to a Montana blizzard." Flynn glanced toward her diminishing woodpile. "How long were you planning to stay?" "Until spring," Nora admitted, her confidence faltering under his practical assessment. Flynn frowned. "That wood won't last 2 weeks, and you've got months ahead." He studied her face. "You're the school teacher, aren't you, from back east?" "I am," Nora replied with a hint of defiance. "I came to teach, but I'm also writing a novel." Something softened in Flynn's expression. "Noble pursuits, both of them, but this isn't Boston, Miss Graham. Up here, survival comes first." As if to emphasize his point, the wind howled louder and the cabin creaked ominously. "What do you suggest?" Nora asked, trying to mask her growing concern. I've got a place about 3 miles west, better built, more supplies. I was heading back there when I saw smoke from your chimney." He hesitated. "You could ride back with me." "It wouldn't be proper in normal circumstances, but these aren't normal circumstances." Nora felt her cheeks flush. "I couldn't possibly. You could die here," Flynn said flatly. "I've seen it happen. Pride isn't worth freezing to death." Before Nora could respond, a new sound emerged from the howling wind, a deep rumble that seemed to shake the very mountain. Flynn's expression changed instantly to alarm. "Avalanche," he said, lunging toward her. "Get away from the—" His warning was cut short as the world exploded around them. The cabin's rear wall collapsed inward as a massive wave of snow crashed through. Nora felt herself lifted and thrown forward. There was a sharp pain, darkness, and then nothing. Flynn's consciousness returned slowly, his head throbbing with each heartbeat. The cabin was dark and freezing cold. He lay half buried in snow, wooden beams pressing against his back. Disoriented, he tried to piece together what had happened: the avalanche, the cabin, the school teacher. "Miss Graham," he called out, his voice hoarse. No response came through the eerie silence. Flynn pushed himself upright, ignoring the pain shooting through his left shoulder. The cabin was nearly unrecognizable. The rear wall and roof had collapsed entirely, leaving only the front portion semi-intact. Snow filled most of the interior space. "Nora," he called again, more urgently. He began digging through the snow with his bare hands, searching desperately for any sign of her. The cold bit into his flesh, but he ignored it. Minutes passed as he excavated the cabin's interior, throwing aside broken furniture and splintered boards. "Please," he whispered, though he wasn't sure to whom. Flynn had never been a praying man, but in that moment he found himself making bargains with any higher power that might be listening. Let her be alive. His hands were going numb, the skin cracking and bleeding, but he continued his frantic search. Nearly 20 minutes had passed when his fingers brushed against fabric. He redoubled his efforts, clearing away more snow until he uncovered a pale hand. "Nora." Flynn dug faster, finally revealing her face. She lay unconscious, her skin frighteningly pale, a gash across her forehead trailing blood into her auburn hair. He pressed trembling fingers to her neck and held his breath until he felt the faint but steady pulse. She was alive. Relief surged through him, immediately followed by renewed urgency. He cleared more snow from around her body, assessing her condition. No obvious broken bones, but she remained unresponsive. The temperature was dropping rapidly as night approached, and the ruined cabin offered little protection. Flynn realized his horse would be gone, likely spooked by the avalanche, and headed back to his own property. They were stranded, and Nora needed shelter immediately. Working methodically, despite his frozen hands, Flynn began clearing a space in the least damaged corner of the cabin. He located her bed, miraculously still intact though displaced, and dragged it to the sheltered area. Next, he found her trunk, pulling out every blanket and piece of clothing it contained. The stove had been knocked over but appeared functional. Flynn righted it, cleared its chimney of snow, and used the few dry logs he could salvage to start a fire. Each task was excruciating with his injured hands, but he forced himself to continue. Once he had created a semblance of shelter, Flynn carefully moved Nora to the bed, wrapping her in layers of blankets. He cleaned the wound on her forehead with melted snow and a strip of cloth torn from his own shirt. "Miss Graham," he said softly, patting her cheek. "Nora, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered and Flynn felt another wave of relief. "That's it, open your eyes." Nora's eyes opened slowly, confusion evident in their green depths. "What happened?" she whispered. "Avalanche hit the cabin," Flynn explained gently. You've been hurt, but you're going to be all right." She tried to sit up but winced in pain. "Everything hurts. Don't move too much. You took a hard fall." Flynn adjusted the blankets around her. "Do you remember me?" Nora's brow furrowed as she studied his face. "Flynn Irwin," she said finally. "You came to check on me." He nodded, surprised at the flood of emotion he felt hearing her say his name. "That's right." "Your hands," she gasped, noticing their condition for the first time. "They're bleeding." Flynn glanced down at his raw, cracked skin. "Had to dig you out, don't worry about it." "Of course I'm worried," Nora insisted weakly. "Let me help. You need to rest," Flynn interrupted. "I'll tend to myself once you're stable." As night fell completely, the temperature plummeted further. The small fire in the stove provided minimal heat against the Montana winter, pouring in through the broken walls. Flynn worked continuously, using furniture and debris to create better barriers against the elements. Nora drifted in and out of consciousness. Each time she woke, Flynn made her drink water and checked her responses. The head wound concerned him most. He'd seen men die from such injuries, even when they seemed alert at first. By midnight, Flynn had done all he could to secure their shelter, but it was woefully inadequate. The fire would not last until morning with their limited wood. They needed a better solution or they wouldn't survive the night. "Nora," he said, kneeling beside the bed, "I need to get you somewhere safer. My cabin isn't too far, but I'll have to carry you." She looked at him through half-lidded eyes. "I don't think I can walk." "You won't have to. I'll carry you." Flynn wasn't certain he had the strength after his injuries and exertions, but he saw no alternative. He gathered their most essential supplies: matches, knife, the remaining food, and all the blankets. He fashioned a rough sled from a cabinet door, creating a makeshift travois he could drag behind him. After bundling Nora in every available layer, he lifted her onto the sled, securing her with strips of torn bedsheet. "This won't be comfortable," he warned, "but it's our best chance." Nora nodded weakly. "I trust you." Those three simple words hit Flynn with unexpected force. How long had it been since anyone had trusted him so completely? Too long to remember. He stepped out into the night, pulling the travois behind him. The storm had subsided somewhat, leaving a clear, star-filled sky that glittered coldly above the transformed landscape. The avalanche had completely altered the familiar terrain, burying landmarks under tons of snow. Flynn oriented himself by the stars and began the arduous journey toward his cabin. Each step was agony. His hands throbbed, his shoulders screamed in protest, and the deep snow made progress painfully slow. Periodically, he stopped to check on Nora, ensuring she remained conscious and warm enough. During one such stop, she looked up at the magnificent canopy of stars. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "I've never seen stars like this in Boston." Flynn followed her gaze. "One benefit of being in the middle of nowhere, I suppose." "Why do you live out here, Mr. Irwin?" Nora asked. "So far from everything." Flynn was silent for a moment. "Found I didn't fit too well in civilized places," he finally said. "Out here, a man is judged by what he does, not who his family is or how he talks." "You're running from something," Nora observed. "Aren't we all?" Flynn replied with a hint of a smile. "Even Boston schoolteachers who come to Montana in winter to write novels." Nora attempted to laugh but winced instead. "Perhaps you're right." They continued their slow progress through the snow. Flynn estimated they had traveled perhaps a mile when Nora's condition worsened. Her responses became confused and her skin felt colder despite the blankets. "Stay with me, Nora," Flynn urged, his voice betraying more emotion than he intended. "Tell me about your novel." "My novel," she murmured. "It's about a woman who leaves everything familiar to find herself." "Sounds familiar," Flynn said, trying to keep her engaged. What happens to her? I don't know yet, Nora admitted. I haven't decided if she's brave or foolish. Maybe she's both, Flynn suggested, pulling the travois over a particularly challenging drift. Bravery often looks like foolishness until it succeeds. Is that experience talking, Mr. Irwin? Flynn, he corrected. And yes, I've been called a fool more times than I can count. They fell into a rhythm, Flynn asking questions to keep Nora alert, and Nora responding with increasingly detailed stories about her life in Boston, her family's disappointment at her career choice, and her dreams of becoming a published author. After what seemed like eternity, Flynn spotted the outline of his cabin through the trees. Relief flooded through him, giving him a final surge of energy to cover the remaining distance. Unlike Nora's rental, Flynn's cabin was built to withstand Montana winters. It sat in a protected valley, its sturdy logs and stone foundation providing a formidable barrier against the elements. When they finally reached the door, Flynn was nearly at the end of his endurance. The interior was cold but intact. Flynn quickly built a fire in the large stone fireplace, then carefully transferred Nora from the travois to his bed. Only when she was settled did he allow himself to examine his own injuries. His hands were in terrible condition, swollen, bleeding, and possibly frostbitten. His left shoulder was likely dislocated rather than broken, but without help he couldn't reset it. Flynn, Nora called weakly from the bed. Please let me help you now. He wanted to refuse to insist she rest, but practicality won out. He needed functioning hands. Under Nora's direction, Flynn prepared a basin of warm water mixed with whiskey. He soaked his hands, gritting his teeth against the burning pain. Nora, despite her own injuries, insisted on bandaging them afterward, her touch gentle as she wrapped strips of clean cloth around his raw skin. Your shoulder, she said, studying the awkward angle of his left arm. It's dislocated. Flynn nodded grimly. Need to set it. I've done it before, but not to myself. Tell me what to do, Nora said, sitting straighter despite obvious pain. Flynn explained the procedure, doubting whether Nora had the strength to execute it in her condition. To his surprise, she proved remarkably capable. Following his instructions precisely, she braced herself and manipulated his arm until the joint slipped back into place with an audible pop. Flynn couldn't suppress his shout of pain, followed immediately by relief as the worst of the agony subsided. Thank you, he managed between ragged breaths. Nora swayed, suddenly pale. Flynn caught her before she could fall, easing her back onto the bed. You've done enough, he said softly. Rest now. The next few days passed in a blur of pain and recovery for both of them. Flynn's hands gradually improved enough for basic tasks, though they remained heavily bandaged. Nora's head injury caused concerning symptoms: headaches, dizziness, and occasional confusion, but slowly showed improvement. They settled into an unexpected domestic routine. Flynn hunted when weather permitted, providing fresh meat to supplement their stored provisions. Nora, once able to stand without dizziness, took over cooking and tending the fire. In the evenings, they talked for hours. Flynn learned that Nora was the youngest daughter of a prominent Boston family who viewed her teaching aspirations as a temporary eccentricity rather than a genuine calling. Nora discovered that Flynn had been a cattle driver in Texas before drifting north, eventually finding work as a guide for mining expeditions before purchasing his small property. Will you go back to Boston when spring comes? Flynn asked one evening as they sat before the fire, nearly 2 weeks after the avalanche. Nora considered the question seriously. I don't know. There's nothing really pulling me back except familiarity. She looked around the cabin. I've learned more about living in these 2 weeks than in 22 years in Boston. Montana winters will teach you that, Flynn agreed with a small smile, though usually not quite so dramatically. It wasn't just the avalanche, Nora said quietly. It's been watching you. The way you approach problems directly, the way you don't waste energy on complaints or pretense. Flynn felt uncharacteristically self-conscious under her thoughtful gaze. That's not virtue, just necessity out here. Perhaps more people should experience necessity then, Nora replied. Myself included. The blizzard that had been threatening for days finally arrived the following morning, trapping them completely in the cabin. Outside, the world disappeared beneath swirling white. Inside, the fire crackled and their conversation continued, growing increasingly personal as the isolation deepened. Flynn found himself sharing stories he'd never told anyone about his father's alcoholism, his mother's early death, his older brother's success, and subsequent rejection when Flynn refused to follow the path laid out for him. My father wanted me to become a banker like him, Flynn explained. When I left instead, he told me never to use the family name again if I was going to disgrace it. Is that why you came west? Nora asked. Partly. Mostly I just needed space to figure out who I was without everyone telling me who I should be. Flynn poked at the fire. What about you? What are you running from? Nora smiled sadly. Expectations. My sisters all married well by 20. My parents had a suitable match arranged for me, the son of my father's business partner. He was pleasant enough, but the thought of that life made you feel like you couldn't breathe. Flynn suggested. Exactly. Nora looked surprised. How did you know? Recognized the feeling. Flynn stood to add another log to the fire. Freedom's worth a lot, even if it comes with avalanches. The storm lasted 3 days, during which their connection deepened beyond either's expectation. Flynn found himself watching Nora when she wasn't looking, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when concentrating, how her eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when she smiled. For her part, Nora discovered aspects of Flynn that contradicted her initial impression of the rough frontiersman. He possessed a collection of well-worn books that would have impressed any Boston intellectual. He played the harmonica with surprising skill. He wrote poetry in a small journal he kept hidden under his mattress, a fact she discovered accidentally while changing bedding. When the storm finally broke, leaving the world transformed under brilliant sunshine, they both felt a strange reluctance to reconnect with the outside world. Nevertheless, practicality demanded it. They needed supplies, and the people of Silvercrest would be worried about their fates. Flynn fashioned a pair of snowshoes for each of them from willow branches and rawhide. After Nora demonstrated sufficient recovery from her injuries, they made the journey to what remained of Silvercrest, primarily the general store and a few scattered cabins occupied by winter residents. News of their survival spread quickly. Mr. Iverson, the shopkeeper, insisted on loading them with supplies at no charge, overwhelmed by relief at finding them alive. The other residents gathered to hear their story, marveling at their escape from the avalanche that had claimed 2 other cabins, fortunately unoccupied at the time. You're welcome to stay here, Mr. Iverson offered Nora. We've a spare room above the shop. Flynn waited for her response, suddenly tense. The thought of Nora leaving his cabin created an unexpected hollow feeling in his chest. Thank you, Nora replied with genuine gratitude, but I've been imposing on Mr. Irwin's hospitality, and I should continue to help with his recovery. She glanced at Flynn's still bandaged hands. His injuries were sustained rescuing me, after all. Relief flooded through Flynn, though he kept his expression neutral. They collected their supplies and began the journey back to his cabin, the return trip considerably easier with proper equipment and healing bodies. That evening, As they prepared dinner together in comfortable silence, Flynn found himself contemplating a future he'd never considered before. He'd always assumed his life would be solitary. That was the path he'd chosen in coming to Montana. Yet now, the thought of returning to that solitude after Nora eventually left seemed unbearable. "You didn't have to stay," he said finally, breaking the silence. "At Iverson's, I mean." "Your head seems much better." Nora paused her chopping. "Do you want me to go?" "No," Flynn answered too quickly. He cleared his throat. "No, I just meant you shouldn't feel obligated." "I don't feel obligated, Flynn." Nora set down her knife and turned to face him. "I stayed because I wanted to." The simple honesty of her statement hung in the air between them. Flynn found himself moving closer to her, drawn by something neither of them had acknowledged. "Nora," he began, uncertain what he intended to say. She saved him the trouble by closing the remaining distance between them. Standing on tiptoes, she pressed her lips gently to his. The kiss was brief but unmistakable in its meaning. When she pulled back, Flynn saw a mixture of vulnerability and determination in her eyes. "I'm not typically so forward," she said softly, "but nearly dying has a way of clarifying what's important." Flynn touched her cheek with his bandaged hand. "And what's important? Not wasting time," Nora replied. "I've spent my whole life being proper and cautious. Look where it got me, buried under an avalanche in Montana." Flynn couldn't help smiling. "Most people would see that as a reason to return to propriety, not abandon it further." "I'm not most people," Nora countered, "and neither are you. That's why we're both here." Flynn kissed her then, properly this time. His bandaged hands cradled her face as though she were made of precious glass. For a man accustomed to the roughness of frontier life, the tenderness he felt surprised him. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Flynn knew his life had irrevocably changed course. The weeks that followed were the happiest either had known. As winter maintained its grip on the mountains, they created their own world within the cabin's walls. Flynn taught Nora to hunt and trap. Nora continued her novel, reading passages aloud in the evenings for Flynn's feedback. Together they planned improvements to the cabin and discussed the possibility of starting a small cattle operation when spring arrived. Their relationship deepened physically as well, propriety giving way to passion. Flynn, despite his rugged exterior, proved to be considerate and gentle. Nora, freed from societal constraints, discovered desires she hadn't known existed. Their nights became as precious as their days. February brought another violent storm, but this time they were well prepared and safely sheltered. As they lay together listening to the wind howl outside, Nora traced the scar on Flynn's shoulder, a permanent reminder of the avalanche that had brought them together. "I should write to my parents," she said quietly. "They probably think I'm dead." Flynn tensed slightly beside her. "What will you tell them?" Nora heard the unasked question beneath his words. "That I've found where I belong," she answered. "That I'm not coming back to Boston." Flynn turned to face her, his expression serious. "Are you certain? This life, it's not easy. It's not what you were raised for." "It's what I choose," Nora said firmly. Unless you don't want me to stay." Flynn took her hand, pressing it against his heart. "I want you with me more than I've wanted anything in my life," he admitted. "But I need you to be sure. Spring looks different from winter. The romance of survival can fade." "This isn't about romance," Nora insisted. "Or at least, not only about romance. It's about finding a place where I can be myself, the person I was meant to be, not the person Boston society expected." She smiled. "That's what my novel is about, remember. A woman finding herself. Turns out I needed to come to Montana to finish the story." Flynn's eyes softened. "In that case," he said, reaching beneath the bed and retrieving something from his hiding place, "I have something to ask you." He opened his palm to reveal a simple ring fashioned from silver. "I made this while you were sleeping," he explained. "It's not fancy like what you'd get in Boston, but it's perfect," Nora whispered, tears forming in her eyes. "Nora Graham," Flynn said, his voice unusually solemn, "will you marry me? Stay with me, build a life with me, grow old with me in these mountains?" "Yes," Nora answered without hesitation. Yes to all of it. They were married in April as the first wildflowers emerged from the melting snow. The ceremony took place outside Flynn's cabin, now their cabin, with the residents of Silvercrest in attendance. Mr. Iverson, as the settlement's senior citizen, performed the ceremony. Nora wore a dress she'd sewn herself from fabric ordered specially from Riverton. Flynn wore the only suit he owned, purchased years ago for a funeral and carefully preserved. As they spoke their vows against the backdrop of mountains that had nearly claimed their lives, both recognized the poetic symmetry of their journey. The same wilderness that had threatened to destroy them had ultimately given them the greatest gift, each other. Nora's novel was completed by summer and sent to a publisher in Chicago. To her surprise and delight, it was accepted, with publication scheduled for the following year. Flynn expanded their property, adding a small herd of cattle and improving the cabin with Nora's help. When winter returned, they faced it together, prepared and unafraid. On the anniversary of the avalanche, they stood outside their cabin in the crisp night air, looking up at the stars. "Strange to think," Nora mused, her arm around Flynn's waist, "if that avalanche hadn't happened, we might never have truly known each other." "I'd have found a way," Flynn replied with certainty. "Some things are meant to be, avalanche or not." As if to punctuate his words, a streak of light crossed the sky, a falling star burning brightly before fading into the darkness. "Make a wish," Nora said. Flynn turned to her, his eyes reflecting the starlight. "Already have everything I could wish for," he said simply. Nora stood on tiptoes to kiss him, grateful for frozen hands that had once dug through snow to find her, and for the warmth they now brought to her life.